Well, welcome everybody to Module 6 and Lecture 6. The title of today's lecture is Trade Transactions, Payment and Insurance. Today's lecture will focus on the export trade transaction up to the goods being placed ready for shipment on the main mode of transport. In the competitive industry of international freight, now more than ever before, freight forwarders are required to understand the intricacies of international export shipments and contracts. So this lecture, with the help of a flowchart of goods and documents, will introduce you to the complexities related to the moving of goods internationally. Now this process has got a number of steps, such as acknowledging, receiving and processing an export order, the preparation and the packing of the goods in the factory, and then the movement of the goods from the factory to the shipping or air terminal ready for departure on the selected method of transport. Now, after detailing the export transaction, I want to briefly discuss three important aspects associated with the shipment of international consignment. Firstly, I want to touch on international commercial terms, or as we might be more familiar with, Incoterms. So Incoterms being consignment delivery terms that specify the risks, the costs and the responsibilities of the buyers and sellers under a given export sales contract, in particular related to the payment of freight, insurance and customs clearance. I'm going to touch on the various Incoterms available for exporters and importers, but I'm not going to go into a lot of detail as this has been covered extensively in other units like exporting and importing. Secondly, another important aspect related to an export consignment deals with the contracted payment of goods sold between the seller and the buyer. Now, given the importance of payment, I'm going to introduce the various types of payment methods briefly, and also in particular focus on one type of payment method because it gives such certainty to exporters over payment, and that's documentary credits, or familiarly or commonly referred to as a letter of credit. And at the same time mention the significant role that banks play towards a successful payment of goods. Finally, I want to touch on insurance, the insurance being critical to the international movement of goods due to the many risks and uncertainties that could lead to damage or loss of cargo. So, most situations, the shippers are going to procure insurance to cover the movement of goods. Of course, with the use of an Incoterm, that can be determined as to who pays for what in that particular process between the seller and the buyer. I'm also going to finish off with just looking at the three main types of insurance available, based on Clause A, Clause B and Clause C, and what constitutes an insurance claim will also be touched on. So our focus questions today are going to be: what are the processes involved in the execution of an export order? What are the key consignment delivery terms available for use by exporters and importers? What are the key choices of payment method often used to pay for goods sold within international trade? What factors are considered when determining the payment method to use in a given situation? What is the cargo insurance and how should shippers be concerned about it. In terms of our readings, they're listed there, a variety of readings. I've selected, tried to be selective with the pages to minimise the reading for you, and there's a couple of sections there that I've got part only, and there's one particular reading there that is optional. So the first focus question I'll seek to answer for you today is, what are the processes involved in the execution of an export order? Now, we've previously discussed the range of knowledge that's needed by freight forwarders, and it's quite extensive and it covers all elements in that movement of goods from the seller to the buyer, and all the ancillary items, as well as the logistical characteristics of the movement itself. So today we're going to have a look at the medium of international trading, so order processing, touch on sales contracts and export and import formalities. We're going to touch on Incoterms. We're also going to look at the financial options, and we're also going to have a quick look at insurance. So to help us go through the first part of the lecture today is a flowchart of goods and document of a typical export trade transaction. And that's a transaction that occurs with the goods being produced and packed, the goods received by the carrier for delivery to an airport or a container terminal, the goods delivered to the wharf, the goods loaded to an aircraft or vessel, the aircraft departing. We're only going to get to that particular point. So the first part of the lecture is going to focus on the export order. Now, in many ways, the export order is a culmination of a negotiation between the seller and the buyer over a variety of different terms and conditions that will dictate how the goods are moved from the seller to the buyer. It's worth noting that before that export order can begin, it starts off or begins with some form of inquiry. Now that could be somebody meeting somebody at a trade show, it could be meeting somebody in their place of business, it could be an inquiry over the phone. So if you're a potential buyer and you've identified some goods, you want to make contact with somebody, you'll use some form of communication medium. And one of the most prolific mediums that's currently used today, of course, is the internet. So that initial export inquiry is that starting point for that negotiation between the seller and the buyer. And it's usually based on an inquiry from a buyer who will ultimately be the importer to the seller who is going to be the exporter of the goods. And usually the exporter begins that process by sending some catalogues or an indicative price list. These days, few catalogues are provided in hard copy form unless you're in the country where the manufacturer is, and most of those catalogues are available by virtue of the internet. Some of them in electronic form, others that could be downloaded in relatively small PDFs if you like. Now, from the importer's point of view, they've instigated the inquiry. They're going to use that information to make some form of decisions about whether it wants to buy the goods from the seller. So the type of additional questions that might be asked by the buyer could be the size of the product, what quantity is required in the form of a purchase. There might be quantity limitations. What type of delivery schedule can the exporter meet? What is the exporter's view in terms of Incoterm? Do they have a particular view on that? Is it going to be FOB, CFR or CIF, or any number of the other Incoterms that are available? How is the exporter going to dispatch goods? What type of packing? What about payment? What are the expectations in regards to payment? And also, do the products require any certification? We know that perishable products usually require certification not only from the exporting government, but more importantly from the importing government in terms of moving those goods into that particular country. Now, once there's been a communication process between the seller and the buyer, it's quite common for the seller to issue a pro forma invoice. So that pro forma invoice is encapsulating all the questions and inquiry that's been made by the prospective importer. So it's going to include key information such as the name of the document, the name of the shipper, the buyer, the shipment information mode, and you'll notice here that this is preliminary to finalising an export order. So there's no details in there in regards to mode of shipment, delivery port, Incode. There is an Incoterm, but mainly around the carriage. That hasn't obviously been booked yet. Shipment date. We've got the Incoterm in there. Carriage pay too, CPT. We've got the product descriptions, and we've got the payment terms, the total amount as well as the payment method and the supplier bank. So it's not unusual that the seller might send that off to the prospective buyer. Now, from the importer or the buyer's perspective, if the offer in the pro forma invoice that we just looked at is acceptable to them, they will usually put into the system what's called a purchase order. So they'll place that purchase order with the exporter, giving as much data as possible in terms of the specifications. So it's picking up all the information in regards to their negotiations to that particular point. Now, best practice for a seller or an exporter is to quickly respond to the potential buyer that they accept that purchase order. However, prior to doing so, it's very important that they check any previous quotation. So the quotation of pro forma invoice needs to be checked, particularly in regards to the level of information provided by the buyer in the purchase order itself. So they need to check the currency and prices. They need to have a look at the product description. They need to check the quantities, because on some occasions sellers have minimum quantities or fixed quantities per carton. They also need to check the terms of trade. Are these the terms of trade that were negotiated during the initial discussion? What about the method of payment? In this particular case, we've got an irrevocable documentary letter of credit payable at site for 100% of the invoice value. Also, in addition to that, are there any other discounts and surcharges that might have been discussed? And has the exporter himself, the seller of the goods, got their export credit insurance available for use if required? Now, in most cases, if you're doing business with a country that perhaps you can't find a lot of information about the buyer, it might be politically unstable, you might consider getting your own export insurance to cover most of the non-payment of the goods. So the next step for the seller of the goods, the exporter, is to acknowledge that exporter order. And if there's anything in regards to the investigation that looks different between the pro forma invoice and the final purchase order, so if any of the previously agreed terms of contract are incorrect or you're uncertain about those, prior to acknowledgement of the export order, they need to be sorted out. However, if everything's consistent and everything's okay, the order acknowledgement should be dispatched as immediately as you possibly can. It could be by email, airmail, electronic data interchange, fax. It's really up to you. And at that particular point in time, that presents you with an opportunity to circulate all the information on the order to all the parties that are involved in that particular order. So, if you've got a bank involved, you might want to send an original to the debtor. Also, a copy is going to go to the consignee, particularly if it's been requested by the debtor, so the consignee being the buyer. Copy for indent or buying agent. So if there was a buying agent, a middleman involved, they'd get a copy. Obviously you want a copy going to your own production department, packing department, and any other copies that may be required. A circulation copy is quite a useful document. It can be then reworked as a export checklist, if you like, and also subsequently you might end up with a master document. It's likely to contribute most of the information to that master document. So in that acknowledgement of the export order to the buyer, it's important that you include key information in there. All that information that's going to enable this export consignment to be facilitated. So the currency and the prices have got to be right. Are there any discounts or surcharges? Making sure that your Incoterms are up to date and consistent with the latest Incoterms. Only this year, from the 1st of January, we have the next instalment in Incoterms 2020. So prior to that, there's Incoterms 2010. Now, there's nothing to say that you can't still rely on Incoterms 2010. However, in your documentation, it's important that you state you're using Incoterms 2010. Otherwise, it's likely to defer to Incoterms 2020. The date of the shipment, the name of the carrier and voyage. This additional information is now going to be able to be provided. Obviously, if depending on your method of payment, that will be in there as well. So, as you can see, you're picking up as much information as you possibly can to reiterate to the buyer the details of the shipment itself. Okay, now once the export order has been received, it's mindful of that during that process, that agreement to get you to the export order, it's quite likely that you've already made some decisions around payment terms. Payment terms are a key element of the negotiation between the contracting parties, and it's a requirement that they agree on payment terms. And it's particularly important if it's a first-time transaction between banks and other financial institutions may become involved in that particular scenario. Also, it's going to depend on the agreed method of payment. So you've got the option of a prepayment or cash in advance, open account, documentary collection, documentary credit. We're going to talk a little bit about the documentary letter of credit. We don't have to go into all of those. I'm pretty sure they've been covered with other units. The documentary letter of credit, if it's agreed, should arrive with the export purchase order and be consistent with the contract of sale. One of the main benefits of a documentary credit, it embodies an undertaking by the issuing bank to make the payment to the exporter. So effectively, what you have here, if you've been able to negotiate a letter of credit, you've been able to negotiate a guarantee of getting paid. Probably the only thing that might stop that happen could be some level of fraud. And that's why banks are very pedantic around the documentation, right to the point of dotting the I's and crossing the T's. That is an example of an irrevocable letter of credit, and it highlights all the key elements in that particular document. One of the additional benefits of an irrevocable letter of credit is that it can't be cancelled by either parties without both people's consent. So it's putting the it's putting the exporter excuse me. It's putting the exporter in quite a strong position of knowing that once he ships off his goods and all the documentation comply with the documentary terms, he's pretty well assured of receiving payment. Okay, so moving beyond the negotiation, we get to a point where we're going to monitor the progress of the goods. And we're going to look at the order being completed and packed, and also placed into production. So in regards to the order fulfillment, the next step in the process is to place the order with the production department of the exporter. Now, a copy of the export purchase order acknowledgement, or the master document, as we've said before, should capture all the specifics of the export transaction. So it's going to cover things such as if there's any special packing instructions. So through that negotiation between the buyer and the seller, the buyer might have suggested that they need particular types of packing or packaging. The important thing from their point of view is that the goods arrive safely and in pristine condition. When the order is placed into production, it also initiates the booking of the space on the transport mode. So whether it's a ship, whether it's an aircraft, whether it's a truck or train, once the order is placed into production, the process of organising transport begins to be arranged. Important that this matches with the purchase order and is also consistent with the payment terms. Other production considerations that you might have in regards to shipping space is that it's really important that before you begin this process, and particularly in regards to payment terms, that you ensure that you've got all the goods as specified by the buyer, or you can produce those goods ready in time for the date of shipment. If you can't do that, that could unhinge the whole export shipment. Also, you've got to be mindful that if you are sending your goods by sea, and to be carried on a container. You need to be mindful of delivery time at wharf or the container base is likely to be 10 days before the scheduled sailing date, so you need to factor that in to your arrangements. In addition to this, you need to have on hand the number of cases, cartons, parcels, the total gross weight, specifically the port of discharge and final destination, and any transshipment, because that needs to be built into any transport mode bookings. At the same time that the goods are being placed into the production department, details around the packing of the shipment should be arranged, and generally goods are packed for shipment at least a few days prior to the scheduled date, on whatever date you have to send that off to the wharf or container depot or the airline terminal. Otherwise, delays could occur. The thing about the goods is that they need to be packed in accordance with the specifications of the client, and whatever the delivery terms and payment terms were. So the letter of credit might state that might make a notation in regards to the packing of the goods, so that needs to take into consideration, as well as include the quantity, and the shipping marks are required as well. Also, when packing the goods, it's wise to have one copy of the packing list outside the case, and also another copy inside the case, because that's going to assist the customer to identify all contents and make a determination if there may have been some form of pilferage along the way. Now, a packing list is not always required. Perhaps if you're moving a case or a crate and it's made up of identical goods, but it is good practice. I suppose one of the important things to always remember with a packing list is never to include a unit price or a value on that shipment, because it's going to provide more information that you really want to provide as those goods move through the logistics chain. So once the goods have been packed, they're ready to go to the terminal. We've got a number of steps. So the goods are handed to the carrier, and all the appropriate documentation will be passed on to the carrier at that particular point in time. The goods are going to be checked and admitted to the wharf or depot, and any other further documentation checks will be undertaken until it is presented to the shipper, the carrier of the goods, and they will issue either an airway bill or a bill of lading, consistent with other documentation that is required. A very worthwhile checklist to keep in mind prior to the goods departing. So best practice suggests that don't deliver goods to the wharf if certain situations arise. And the first one is if you've got incomplete documentation. So if there's an expectation that you have a document relating to the payment terms, then don't deliver the goods without it. If you find yourself in a situation where the payment terms indicated a particular date of departure, you can't meet that date, so you're not complying with the conditions of the documentary credit, don't send the goods to the wharf. The best thing you can do is get in contact with your buyer and make sure that they're happy to make an amendment on that documentary credit. Also, there might be some middle people involved in the process of you facilitating that export order. So if you haven't got a confirming order from a confirming house, or perhaps you haven't got the right documentation to get it into the importing country, all those issues are issues that should stop you from delivering those goods to the wharf. Now, if you're dealing with a business in a country perhaps for the first time, or a country that's got some form of political upheaval, you might be relying on export credit insurance. If that hasn't arrived, then don't send your goods to the wharf. And if you cannot ship on that confirmed date, as I said before, advise your customer of the delay to inform them of a new shipping date and get their approval. Otherwise you're likely to get a stop in the delivery of those goods. Also, of course, if you haven't communicated already with the Australian Border Force, so you haven't received an export declaration number, that's something that you will need to do before sending your documents up. So the goods are handed to the carrier, the goods arrive at the shipping terminal. Before they do head off on that final journey, it's important to check those receiving and sailing dates and check them for accuracy, because that's a critical element in regards to if you are dealing with banks, as I've mentioned on a couple of occasions. Make sure that the cargo is arriving at the depot or the wharf or the airport with the appropriate documentation. So the driver will require a number of documents to facilitate that delivery to that particular terminal. So they're going to need things such as perhaps an interim receipt or a forwarding instruction, and if it's containerised shipment, he should also have a pre-receival advice, so that you've already communicated with the container terminal that your goods, and you booked that in, as well as ensuring that the EDN, your export declaration number, and any other permit documents have also been met and are available for review. Now, once you've been able to verify that document at the wharf, at the airport, it's ready for unloading. Now, you'll be dealing with somebody who will then tally the contents and also, if appropriate, check the condition. In other words, if there appears to be some form of leakage out of the container, they're going to check that. Now, if there are some reasons for the tally didn't add up, for example, it was supposed to be 19 packages and there are only 16, or perhaps the condition of the goods as they arrive, perhaps there's some level of damage. Now, that's likely to require some form of notation on the documentation, and before the goods are unloaded, this needs to be sorted out. So essentially it would require the person who's bringing those goods to the terminal to contact the exporter and get some immediate instructions in regards to what happens to those particular goods. Once that's sorted out, or if you haven't had any issues with tally or condition, the unloading is completed. The person who you're dealing with, which we'll call a tally clerk, issues one copy of the PRA or interim receipt or forwarding instruction, which we'll call the shipper's copy, and returns it to the driver as the exporter's receipt that the shipment has arrived at the wharf or depot. The tally clerk is going to keep the other copy, which is what we'll call the wharf copy. So, to complete this export transaction, we need to have a level interaction with the carrier of the goods themselves. So following the delivery of the goods, export documentation must be completed accurately and promptly on behalf of the carrier themselves. So the forwarding agent, it could be a freight forwarder, or the shipping company will prepare a bill of lading. And as soon as that bill of lading has been prepared, they will notify the shipper that it's signed or it's ready for collection. So either the exporter or the agent for the exporter, the freight forwarder, will then collect the bill of lading. Now, prior to release of shipments, if the notation on the documentation is that freight is prepaid, the shipping company must receive their payment of freight and outward wharfage charges. And often this is undertaken by the forwarding agent themselves to pay for this, to enable them to get hold of the bill of lading and their documents. Now, if there is a bank involved, the bill of lading, together with other documents, such as the invoice, will then be required to be presented at the exporter's bank, usually with some additional documentation which is commonly referred to as a draft. It's going to be either at site, which means you get paid immediately that the goods are sent off and that the documents arrive at the importer's bank, or a term draft, which means that the payment will be made sometime down the track that they've agreed to. Okay, so that's our execution of an export order. We're now going to look at some other elements that impact on that particular process. So, one of the key essential elements of a sales contract is Incoterms. Incoterms is a shortened version of international commercial terms, and they're a set of international rules which make it easier for the buyer and seller to interpret their negotiation to finalise their sales contract. Now, the most recent Incoterms was, as I mentioned before, that was released only this year, and it's been 10 years since the previous Incoterms were released. So Incoterm 2010. So Incoterms seek to improve Incoterms based on this ever-changing nature of today's international trading system. In particular, Incoterms 2020 has recognised the need for bills of lading to have onboard notation. Also, it aligns different levels of insurance coverage for different terms as well, and a number of other subtle changes that they've made along the way. The 2010 edition was quite a significant change, so 2020 hasn't actually needed much updating, mainly because 2010 was a little bit of a watershed in many ways, because it took into account the changes in international trade practices and transportation techniques over the last 2 decades. And in particular, that's been the impact of containerisation, and where certain Incoterms are limited to bulk and break bulk cargo shipments, and other terms not to be used for container shipments. So on the right hand side of the you'll see a slide. It's a pie chart. Now this pie chart shows you the usage among exporters of manufactured goods in the Asian region, and it shows you the Incoterms that they typically use. And common terms are carriage, insurance and freight. So almost 30% or a third of transactions that are recorded around manufactured goods in the Asian region are carriage, insurance and freight. 14% are carriage and freight. Free on board is 15%, and ex-works is 18%. So a couple of key points about Incoterms. Primarily, Incoterms are used to assist exporters and importers to inform their sales contracts. So when they're undertaking that negotiation, they help them make decisions around a whole range of issues and their obligations in relation to the delivery of the goods from the seller to the buyer. And they focus on three key areas: costs, risks and insurance. Now, Incoterms, however, have got their limitations. So they're not a contract in themselves. They don't determine or conclude a contract. They don't specify or impact or inform the price payable or the currency or credit terms. They don't override any contractual law obligations between the parties, and probably most importantly, they don't define where the title to the goods transfer. A couple of really good diagrams here to assist exporters and importers understand their obligations and charges and their risks. The first one is a responsibility in regards to obligations and charges for a contract of sale. So down the left hand side, Incoterms inform all those particular elements of a contract by indicating who has got an obligation to fulfill them. So export packaging, loading, forwarder fees, freight, air freight, ocean freight, customs clearance, import duties. For each of the Incoterms, depending on how you're moving the goods, you've got a level of understanding, both parties, almost instantaneously, over what they'll be paying for. Also, in regards to the point of delivery and the transfer of risk, we can see here that for every term we can identify where the seller's obligation starts and where it's finished, and where the risk of the shipment is passed to the other party. So as I said, Incoterms are not always used for every contractual arrangement. It may not be appropriate for one reason or another. However, as you can see, it does provide some really good advice to understand what your obligations might be. Okay, we're now going to have a look at the key choices of payment method often used to pay for goods sold within an international trade, and also what factors are considered when determining the payment method to use a given situation. So this particular continuum is the payment of an export consignment, and at one end of the continuum you have the exporter or the seller, and at the other end of the continuum you've got the importer or the buyer. Now, some forms of payment are going to be more secure for the buyer, and other forms are going to be less secure. Conversely, some forms are going to be more secure for the seller and less secure for the seller. So if we consider both parties sitting down the table, considering how they're going to deal with the payment decision, we know that the exporter, what's driving them is the need to get paid. So in a perfect world, they would like to get paid before the goods actually leave the premises, because they have got a level of anxiety over not losing control over the merchandise. So once that merchandise is out of their hands, they get a little bit concerned about the investment that they've made in preparing the goods and getting them ready to send off to a buyer. So with that in mind, if they can get cash in advance, that's the best case scenario for them. However, most buyers don't really want to provide cash in advance. They want to make sure that they're getting what they paid for as well. So hence the negotiation process. Now, probably last on the list for an exporter is that they have to provide the goods on consignment, which effectively means that they send off their goods, the buyer gets the goods, and sometime down the track, based on an agreement, the buyer, once they've been able to sell the goods, will then remit the payment back to the seller. So that's the last situation that they really want to find themselves in. However, they might be prepared to do that if they know the buyer very well, or they might need to do that if they need, perhaps they might be a little bit more desperate to make that sale. Maybe they just want to dip their toes into the export scenario just to understand the process and whether there's demand for its product. Now, from the importer's perspective, what they're driven by is getting exactly what they paid for. And they really want to receive those goods in a pristine condition. So, from their perspective, if they could get the goods on consignment, they can actually fully inspect the goods, they can make sure that they're in a pristine condition, they can then assist themselves with cash flow by selling the goods and then remitting the payment onto the seller, best case scenario. However, if the seller is playing hardball and expecting cash in advance, that's going to put them in a difficult position. So ultimately both parties have got to work together to work out the appropriate payment mechanism and ensure that it's consistent with the terms and conditions agreed to with other elements of the sales contract. Now, I'm not going to talk about all those varieties of payment terms, but I just want to speak a little bit to a letter of credit. Now, as you can see on that continuum, a letter of credit is quite popular with the exporter. It's not as popular as a cash in advance, but a letter of credit is almost to a point of getting a guarantee of payment, whereas your importer, a letter of credit is only a little bit better than cash in advance. However, it does provide them with some level of protection. So the characteristics of a letter of credit or a documentary credit is that it's one of the most secure export payment methods. And as I said before, it's a commitment on behalf of the buyer through his bank that payment will be made to the seller. So a guaranteeing that the seller will receive the specified amount of money within the specified time as detailed in the letter of credit. So if the letter of credit specified that the payment had to be made at site, so site of the documents, then the payment needs to be paid immediately. it's, as I said before, it's commonly used by an exporter perhaps who's finding it difficult to get additional information on the foreign buyer, and or you're making a contract with somebody for the first time. So there isn't a track record, you haven't developed any level of trust between both parties. And for both parties really, for both the buyer and the seller, it's a really good approach to minimising fraud, more so on the so it does give that importer some level of confidence that they get a form of protection as well. Typically used in situations where it's a high risk trade relationship. As I said before, it's difficult to get a bearing on the credit worthiness of the importer. The information you tend to get is unsatisfactory, or you can't verify it. The importer themselves are a new customer, so you haven't got a track record, no operating history. The exporter is satisfied with the credit worthiness of the buyer's bank, because effectively a letter of credit is guaranteed by the buyer's bank. So you'll likely use that if you're satisfied with their credit worthiness. And also that the political and commercial risk in the importer's home country are going to be high. That's going to give you a level of uncertainty in regards to the transaction itself. Other things that might come to mind in regards to a letter of credit is that whether you need some additional guarantee on the letter of credit. Now we know that an irrevocable letter of credit is almost the highest level that you can get, but you can also ask your own bank for a confirmed letter of credit, which is an additional guarantee on top of the importer's bank's guarantee that you're getting. You also, if you're going to go with a letter of credit, you want to be very confident you can meet all the terms. So if the delivery dates have been specified, you need to fulfill them, or it could get in the way of that payment being made. So you're dealing with banks who are very keen to stop any form of fraud. So you also need to be fastidious in regards to the accuracy of all documentation. This payment method, as I said before, it's not fully simply as a benefit to the seller. It also evens out the risk between both parties. Okay, so moving along to cargo insurance, we're quickly going to have a look at cargo insurance. And I guess the first thing to say about cargo insurance is that it's dealt under two forms of legislation. The first form of legislation dealing with the carriage of goods by sea is the Marine Insurance Act of 1909. Now, this particular act, which has been operating since that early 1900s, so it's been going over 100 years, has only had a few amendments over time, so it has stood the test of time, mindful that a lot of the terminology is these days a little bit outdated and archaic, but the general tenet of the Act itself is still in place. The MIA is based on a freedom of contract approach. However, if you're dealing outside of sea, you're dealing with air and land, so surface transport, a general insurance law is governing the movement of goods over air and land, and that's called the Insurance Contracts Act of 1984. Now, why are there two acts? Look, it's probably due to the fact that it's more history than logic. There are a number of similarities, and there hasn't been a requirement to update those acts over time to reflect the bringing together of the various clauses in those acts. So if we have a look at the Marine Insurance Act versus the Insurance Contracts Act, what it tells us is the Marine Insurance Act covers imports and exports by sea, but it also includes land transit incidental to the sea voyage. So most sea voyage requires some incidental transport to facilitate that, and the Marine Insurance Act is going to cover that. In terms of Insurance Contracts Act, it's air shipments or pure inland transit risks, solely focused on those two areas. So what the Marine Insurance Act says is that a contract of marine insurance may, by its express terms or by its usage of the trade, be extended so as to protect the insured against losses on inland waters and any land risk that might be incidental to the sea voyage. It covers beyond that main area of carriage of the sea. In terms of differences between the MIA and the ICO, a few subtle differences. The amount recoverable is based on the values of the insured items when risk commences under MIA. Under MIA, the broker is liable to the insurer for the payment of premium. The insured is not required to disclose that he's previously been refused insurance cover. Now, in terms of essential concepts around this idea of in insurance contracts, there's 5 major terms that you'll find enshrined in an insurance contract. And the first one is insurable interest. Now, this is a situation where the claimant must have a legal or financial interest in the subject matter at the time of entering into the insurance contract and at the time of loss. So if you're seeking to make a claim for an insurance that you've got, you can only do that if you've got a financial interest in the goods. Now, there are a couple of exceptions to that. The first one is that if insurance arrangement on behalf of the buyer, such as Incoterms CIF, so Incoterms can influence this particular situation. Also, where the buyer on-sells the goods while they're in transit is also an option for an exception. The next essential concept of an insurance contract is what's called duty of disclosure. And this is where the potential insured must provide all material information to the insurer before entering into an insurance contract. So, if the insured fails to do so and makes a claim on the insurer, they have grounds to deny the claim. The next essential concept is called utmost good faith. The potential insured must provide all the material information to the insurer before entering into an insurance contract. If the insured fails to do so and makes a claim, the insurer has grounds to deny the claim. obligation to minimise loss. So an obligation to minimise loss means that the insured has a general obligation to minimise the losses being suffered, so as to minimise the amount of claim payable to the insurer. And the last one is subrogation, and that's where the insurer will, in a sense, step into the shoes of the insured and use the name and require the cooperation of the insured in pursuing legal action. Now, enabling the insurer to recover from a third party. So, if there's a third party that has caused a loss to the insured goods, the amount of claim paid to insured for the loss can be recovered by the insurer. Okay, now typically insurance, particularly in regards to marine policy, are going to have based on three different types of institute cargo clauses, and the first one is Clause A. Now, Clause A covers all risks of loss, physical or damage to the subject matter insured. So in that sense, it's the highest level of insurance that you can get. So the words all risk mean fortuitous loss, except for specifically excluded situations. And there's a number of them there. So if there's any form of misconduct involved, perhaps the packaging hasn't been done correctly, if there's been some level of vice, if there's been a delay, if there's insolvencies or default by the carrier, all those are excluded from being able to have full coverage. Now, B clauses are similar to C clauses, but they provide additional cover, and it relates to being reasonably attributed to an earthquake, a volcanic eruption, or lightning. So it's offering some additional cover from the base cover, or it's caused by the goods being washed overboard, perhaps the entry of a lake, a sea, a river into the vessel, or the loss of a package overboard. And the basic level of coverage, the C coverage, is generally a coverage that covers fire or explosion, the vessel itself becoming stranded or grounded, collision or contact with another vessel, discharge of the cargo at a port of distress, or caused by general average sacrifice or jettison. Now, as I said, Incoterms 2020 have been going since the 1st of January. They've set out some new insurance, standard insurance arrangements, and require carriage and insurance paid to use as default insurance coverage ICCA or equivalent instead of ICCC. So they've increased the requirements around insurance if you're going to rely on those two Incoterms. Now, there are, depending on what approach you're taking with your various policies, there are generally a number of regimes that might be determined. So that will be dependent on your insurance contracts. There's a number of different options that you have, and exclusions are going to vary depending on whether you're using ICC, whether it's also other variations under the UNCTAD. So there's a range of different sort of considerations in that regard. We're not getting down to that level of detail. I guess it's enough to say that there are exclusions to an insurance contract for a range of different reasons. However, really today was more about just recognition of some of the main components of insurance and perhaps those three different options in terms of how you want to organise your coverage. So that's the end of our lecture today. So we covered a number of questions that you can see there, and we'll look forward to talking to you again in another week, and hopefully we'll also be seeing you at the tutorial, which is at 10 o'clock every Tuesday. Anyway, bye for now.